They've been called snowflakes, fragile, screen-addicted, allergic to hard work. Generation Z has become the favourite punchline of every older generation's frustration. But what if those labels are not descriptions? What if they are misunderstandings? This is the first generation to grow up with the internet in their pockets and uncertainty in their bones. They practiced active shooter drills before they learned algebra. They watched adults argue about climate collapse while being told to plan for a future that looked increasingly imaginary. And somewhere between TikTok notifications and student loan calculators, they learned a quiet lesson. The old map no longer matches the territory. So when people say Gen Z is anxious, maybe anxiety is the rational response to an anxious world. When they refuse to worship the 9 to 5, maybe they are not lazy. Maybe they've simply noticed the contract is broken. Behaviour that looks like weakness from the outside can be survival from the inside. To understand Gen Z, we can't just look at their habits. We have to look at the soil they grew in, the algorithms that shaped their attention, the economy that shaped their hope, and the families that shaped their sense of safety. This is not a trial. It's a diagnosis. Welcome to the psychology of Gen Z. Let's begin with the place Gen Z actually grew up. Not in bedrooms or classrooms, but inside algorithms. Neuroscientists talk about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to wire itself around the environment it lives in. For Gen Z, that environment was a glowing rectangle. Notifications arrived before emotional vocabulary. Swiping came before silence. Their nervous systems learned to expect stimulation, the way previous generations expected daylight. People love to repeat the myth that Gen Z has an 8-second attention span. But that's not quite true. Their attention isn't shorter, it's faster and more selective. After processing thousands of posts a day, they developed a highly sensitive BS filter. If something doesn't feel authentic within a heartbeat, they scroll. Not because they're shallow, but because survival in the attention economy requires ruthless efficiency. Yet every adaptation has a price. Platforms are built on dopamine loops, tiny rewards delivered unpredictably, like a slot machine in your pocket. The brain learns to crave the next hit. One more video, one more like, one more refresh. Meanwhile, another system stays permanently switched on. Continuous partial attention. The mind never fully rests. It hovers in a state of low-grade alert, and cortisol, the stress hormone, quietly rises in the background. Add blue light disrupting sleep, group chats that never truly end, and the pressure to maintain a digital identity. And you get a generation that is not distracted. They are neurologically exhausted. This is why many Gen Zers feel both overstimulated and empty at the same time. Their brains were trained to consume at the speed of a river, while human emotions still move at the speed of rain. The mismatch lives in their bodies. Growing up inside algorithms didn't make them weaker, it made them different. Psychologists use a term called locus of control, the feeling of where power over your life actually lives. Inside you or somewhere out in the world. For many baby boomers, the answer was simple. Work hard, stay loyal, buy a house, climb the ladder. The economy they inherited rewarded patience like a promise kept. That environment nurtured an internal locus of control, the belief that effort equals outcome. Gen Z grew up in a different equation. They watched parents lose homes in 2008, saw tuition triple while wages stood still, and entered adulthood during a pandemic that laid people off with a 15-minute Zoom call. They did the math on housing prices and realized the American dream now requires 2 full-time incomes, a side hustle, and a miracle. When the system stops responding to effort, the mind quietly shifts to an external locus of control. The sense that invisible forces, not character, decide the future. Older generations call this attitude laziness. Psychology calls it learned helplessness. This is the soil where quiet quitting grew. Not from apathy, but from a broken contract. Why sacrifice your 20s for companies that speak about family and fire people by email? To a boomer, long hours and moral virtue. To Gen Z, they are a gamble with terrible odds, so they optimize differently. They value flexibility over titles, sanity over prestige, boundaries over loyalty. What looks like low ambition is often a rational response to an economy that stopped keeping its promises. Hope didn't disappear, it became cautious, suspicious, conditional. And when hope becomes expensive, a generation learns to protect itself by expecting less. That isn't weakness, it's economic realism wearing the mask of indifference. Gen Z is the most connected generation in human history, and statistically, the loneliest. They wake up inside group chats, fall asleep to live streams, and carry entire communities in their pockets. Yet many describe a strange hollow feeling, surrounded by voices but rarely touched by one. This is the paradox of modern connection, quantity without weight. Psychologists call one part of this parasocial relationships. A teenager can spend hours with a streamer, laugh at their jokes, watch them eat breakfast, feel as if they truly know them. The brain even releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone, just like it would with a real friend. But the bridge only goes one way. Intimacy becomes a simulation, warm, vivid, and ultimately unreachable. Meanwhile, real-world connection demands risk. Awkward pauses, unreadable faces, the possibility of rejection. Digital interaction is clean. Human interaction is messy. Over time, the social muscles weaken, and many Gen Zers step into adulthood fluent in emojis, but anxious in eye contact. Add the spotlight effect on steroids, the feeling of always being watched, always performing for an invisible audience, and authenticity becomes dangerous. Even private moments start to feel like content. How do you relax when your personality has become a brand? Dating apps multiply options, but thin out commitment. Ghosting replaces goodbye. Third places, where friendships used to grow, malls, churches, community centres, quietly disappear. Connection turns into a marketplace and people into profiles. So the generation that can reach anyone, anywhere, often ends up sitting alone with their phone, waiting to feel real. Before algorithms, before the economy, there was home. And many Gen Z homes were quieter than they looked. Their parents were the first generation asked to be everything at once: providers, friends, therapists, and perfect online families. 2 incomes became mandatory, not aspirational. Even in loving households, exhaustion moved in like an uninvited roommate. Dinner conversations shortened, worries were swallowed instead of spoken. Attachment theory tells us that children learn what relationships feel like long before they learn what relationships mean. When caregivers are stressed, distracted, or emotionally unavailable, a child doesn't conclude, "My parent is overwhelmed." The child concludes, "My needs are too much." From that soil grew 2 familiar patterns. Some Gen Zers became anxiously attached, chasing reassurance they never quite received. Others learned to be avoidant, convincing themselves they didn't need anyone at all. Independence turned into armor. This is also why therapy language spread so quickly. Words like boundaries, triggers, emotional safety didn't appear. Because Gen Z is dramatic, they appeared because many finally found a vocabulary for feelings that had no witnesses at home. Add the backdrop of rising divorce rates, latchkey afternoons, and parents glued to their own screens, and you get a generation that learned to raise parts of itself alone. They became fluent in self-soothing before they were fluent in asking for help. Their sensitivity is not softness, it is the echo of rooms where too much went unsaid. Previous generations inherited identities like old furniture, heavy, predefined, difficult to move. Gen Z inherited a construction site. For them, The self is not a destination, but a draft. Careers can change 5 times, pronouns can shift, aesthetics can be rebuilt overnight. Flexibility has become a survival skill. Yet living in a permanent beta version of yourself carries its own vertigo. If everything is possible, nothing feels solid. Algorithms quietly participate in this process. The platforms that entertain also suggest who you might be, what music matches your mood, what politics fit your feed, what kind of person people like you usually become. Identity becomes a collaboration between inner desire and digital recommendation, a mirror partly held by strangers. This is why many Gen Zers speak of feeling fragmented. One version at school, another online, another with family. The self turns into a playlist rather than a single song. Body image has followed the same path. Filters reshape faces before confidence can form. A generation grows up meeting their edited reflection first, and the unfiltered body feels like the imposter. Psychologists now talk about filter dysmorphia, the pain of not resembling your digital twin. For young men, the collapse of old models of masculinity leaves a vacuum. For young women, the pressure to be empowered and perfect at once feels like a double exam with no study guide. Identity freedom is beautiful. Identity uncertainty is exhausting. Gen Z lives in the space between those truths. For decades, the deal was simple. Give a company your loyalty and it will give you a future. Gen Z arrived to find the contract already torn. They watched parents collect decades of dedication only to be replaced by an algorithm or a younger resume. They saw family culture dissolve into a 15-minute layoff call. Trust, once inherited, now has to be earned line by line. So Gen Z entered the workforce asking a different question. What is this costing my life? Not just in hours, but in sanity, relationships, and sleep. When meaning disappears, productivity feels like borrowing time from yourself. This is the psychology behind boundaries, in email signatures, behind refusing unpaid overtime, behind the phrase, "my mental health comes first." Older managers hear entitlement. Many Gen Zers hear self-preservation. The rise of side hustles tells the same story. For some, it looks like ambition. For many, it is simply rent wearing a creative costume. The creator economy promises freedom while quietly demanding constant performance, turning hobbies into shifts and personalities into products. Burnout now arrives before promotions do. 23-year-olds speak the language once reserved for midlife crises. Exhaustion, cynicism, loss of purpose. Work that cannot be connected to identity or impact begins to feel like a slow leak in the soul. Gen Z isn't rejecting labour, they are rejecting labour without dignity. And in that refusal, a new social contract is being written, one that measures success not only by income, but by the shape of a life outside the office. Older generations were taught to survive first and feel later. Gen Z decided to reverse the order. They speak about anxiety the way their grandparents spoke about the weather, openly, casually, without shame. Therapy is no longer a last resort. It is a maintenance plan. What once sounded like confession now sounds like vocabulary. Boundaries, triggers, burnout, dissociation. To some adults, this looks like obsession with diagnosis, but language changes what pain can become. When a feeling has a name, it stops being a monster in the dark and turns into a problem with edges. Gen Z also grew up during collective wounds no textbook prepared them for. Pandemic isolation, political hostility, school shooting drills, endless footage of disasters in their pockets. The nervous system learned to live in emergency mode. Naming mental health was not a trend, it was a map. Of course, there are shadows. Words can become labels, labels can become identities, and identity can shrink around a symptom. The culture sometimes confuses awareness with healing. Yet even that confusion is a step beyond silence. What this generation understands intuitively is simple. Unspoken pain does not disappear. It organizes the body from the basement. So they talk. Online, in group chats, in therapist offices, in comment sections at 3 in the morning. They are building a public language for private storms, refusing to treat suffering as a personal failure. And whether older generations agree or not, the stigma is already losing. If you measure strength by how much someone can endure in silence, Gen Z will always look fragile. But they change the ruler. For them, resilience is not a clenched jaw. It is the courage to say, "I'm not okay." It is choosing rest over performance, therapy over pretending, boundaries over applause. The battlefield moved from factories to nervous systems, and survival learned a new posture. This generation builds families out of choice, rather than blood. Group chats that feel warmer than living rooms. Online communities that notice when someone disappears. Connection is being redesigned in smaller, braver shapes. They are also learning a different rhythm with technology. Digital hygiene, turning off notifications, protecting sleep, stepping outside without documenting it, has become a quiet rebellion. Not against progress, but against being owned by it. Meaning, more than productivity, is becoming the compass. Many Gen Zers would rather earn less and live more than inherit a lifestyle that empties them slowly. They are experimenting with softer definitions of success. A calm nervous system, a few honest friendships, work that doesn't require leaving the self at the door. This is resilience that looks gentle from afar and radical up close. It admits limits. It asks for help. It refuses to confuse suffering with virtue. Gen Z is teaching the rest of us that strength can be flexible, that healing can be communal, and that a life measured only in output was never a life at all. So, is Gen Z broken? Or are they simply the first to breathe the air the rest of us will soon inhale? Every generation believes the one after it is weaker. Yet history often tells the opposite story. The young are not symptoms of decline, they are sensors of change. The anxiety Gen Z carries may be the nervous system of a planet under pressure. Their refusal to accept empty work may be the early blueprint of a fairer economy. Their openness about mental health may be the language future families will speak fluently. They are not destroying the old world out of spite, they are testing it for cracks. And perhaps the real question isn't what is wrong with Gen Z, but what their discomfort is trying to warn us about. Loneliness disguised as connection, progress without meaning, growth without care. If we listen instead of judging, they might teach us how to be human in a century that forgot the instructions. Thank you for watching. If you're part of Gen Z, tell me in the comments. Do you feel misunderstood or finally seen? And if you're a boomer or millennial, what is one thing you've learned from this generation? If this conversation spoke to you, consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the psychology behind our everyday lives. Let's keep bridging the gap, one story at a time. Thank you for watching.